Now, where JavaScript fits here? So at the beginning of web applications, it was all just plain text at the beginning, and then we formatted the text. And as things happen, more use cases appear. And needs for more sophisticated work appear as well. Okay, so how did we come into needing JavaScript? Now, remember this whole process of how the web applications work? Now, when the server sends the resources just as they are, so the server just copies the resource and send it as it is to the client, we call that static content. Okay, the server doesn't have any input in the content. It just finds where it is, create a copy of it, and then send it to the client. So that from the server point of view, this is called static content. Okay. Now, if the server needs to do any work in order to generate the HTML content dynamically, we call this dynamic application or a dynamic content. Okay. Now, in early days of the web, any dynamic generation or any processing of user interaction had to be handled on the server. The client's only job was to just interpret the HTML. But if the user clicks a button or do any action, that action has to be processed on the server. See, you have to go through all the entire cycle for every single action. Okay, so now you can imagine that was before the introduction of JavaScript. Now you can imagine that how slow that was. So every action the user does or any kind of processing needed to be handled on the server, going through all the entire cycle. All right. Now, in order to make web applications more efficient, Netscape introduced the concept of a client-side language that is the JavaScript that we know right now, or a version of it. Okay. So what happens is that things that doesn't really need to go to the server can be handled on the client instead of having to go through all the entire cycle. Things like if you want to check whether a field is not empty or whether a field falls format, that doesn't need to go to the server, right? It can be handled on the client. So that made web applications much more efficient. Now there are some things that still needed to go to the server, something like checking user if the username and password are correct, credentials of username, that's stored in a database, so that has to be done on the server. So there's still some work done on the server and still needed the full cycle. But there are a lot of things that didn't need to go to the server, so it was much more efficient to be handled on the client. So that language, that new concept of a client-side language was introduced for that purpose. Okay. Now, this language, it wasn't called JavaScript at the beginning, but they called it JavaScript in order, just for the sake of marketing. Okay. But because of how efficient it made applications work, other companies that created browsers like Microsoft, for example, started to introduce similar concepts, but they had different language or similar languages, not exactly identical. They called it JavaScript. Okay, other companies started to join as well with their own versions, claiming that they support the JavaScript language. Now, again, just like when the internet started and then popularity mandated that we needed a standard, that again happened with JavaScript. Everybody have a different version that are claiming to be supporting JavaScript. We needed a standard. So the European Computer Manufacturers Association, or ECMA, this is a standardization organization created a standard for that client-side scripting language. Okay, so oftentimes you will see that ECMA or ECMAScript used as a synonym to JavaScript, just because the language JavaScript has to follow that standard. But originally, the ECMA was the standard, the set of rules. Okay, but now they just use it interchangeably. ECMAScript or JavaScript, we're talking about the same thing. Okay, or and sometimes abbreviated as ES. Okay. Now here's the thing: the standard didn't mention the browser as the only environment. So the language could be processed within any environment. You just need some kind of environment. Okay, the browser was not. It's not seen. I mean, JavaScript is not seen as an only client side, or it has to run on the browser only anymore. Okay. Now we're gonna talk about we're gonna see the different versions of the ECMAScript in a bit, but just one warning before we move to that. All of you have studied Java, right? In 1036. So there is a very source of confusion. First of all, the name, because the name is similar, so a lot of people think that they are the similar languages. They are not similar languages. They are very different in terms of how they work. Okay, they just use the word Java just because Java was very popular. They wanted to ride on the trend, as we say these days. So the term Java was trendy, so they just wanted to ride on the trend, and they called the language same name. But it's not similar language. What adds to the confusion, the fact that a lot of the syntax in JavaScript looks a lot like the syntax in Java. And that caused a lot more confusion, because you may think just because the syntax was the same, it would behave the same. No, it's very different. We're gonna emphasize the differences between the two languages. Now, the similar problem happen with people who have background in Python now, because there is a lot of constructs in Python, looks very much similar to the constructs on JavaScript. It gives you the impression that it's gonna behave the same, and adds to that Python is also scripting language. So you may be able to copy some code from Python and paste it in JavaScript, and it's not going to give you an error, but it's not necessarily going to behave the same. So the concept of dictionary in Python, for example, looks very much similar to the concept of object in JavaScript. Looks similar, but it doesn't always behave the same. Okay, so we need to keep that in mind. Okay. Now, if you go to the this week's content page, here's the Wikipedia page that mentions the versions of ECMAScript or JavaScript. Okay. Now you can see here there's a big jump between the 2009 and the 2015. Okay, so earlier they used to call the versions by just a number, so 5, 4, 3, stuff like that. But then later on they changed that and used the year the version was introduced. So this used to be called ES6, but now it's called ECMAScript 2015 to indicate the year. Okay, now you see, notice this jump. After that, there was like a version almost every year. Now this version, this ECMAScript 6 or 2015, introduced a lot of the changes on how the language worked. Okay, it almost reinvented the language and became popular again. So it was popular for some point, and then it like kind of slowed down, and then it became popular again all of a sudden after these changes were introduced. Okay, so most of the concepts that we're going to focus on in this course are concepts that were introduced in this version, 2015 or ES6. Now, the changes that were introduced after that are not major. They are minor, like advanced concepts that didn't change the nature of the language, okay, but they added some extra features. So we're gonna focus on the basic or the main features that were introduced here in this version that have revolutionized the language. All right, and then at the very last week, if we have time, we can talk about more advanced features. All right, any questions so far? Yes.
Why is the file format ES not there?
Not why he was.
File format ES. Why is it not there?
So ES is the abbreviation of the ECMAScript, right? It's the same.
Oh.
It's the same. It's the same. It's used interchangeably now.